The Black Ship side story shifts its focus from chaos and survival to something far more complex: state building. While the familiar unpredictability of Black Ship events still lingers in the background, this chapter introduces names once mentioned but never explained: Elizabeth, Rachel, and others whose stories begin here. With the creative leadership of David Fraud, and careful supervision to maintain continuity and quality, this narrative unfolds as a grounded yet powerful expansion of the universe. And so, the story begins. Wyatt stood silently, staring down at the digital map of his newly assigned barony. After accounting for terrain and geography, the system calculated a total of 418.3 square kilometers under his control. It didn't feel real. A quick orbital scan from the Naravio had mapped everything in precise detail. 3 settlements stood out: a small village on the northern coast, a larger town to the south, and a tiny hamlet nestled deep within the forest beside a lake. Over 4,000 structures had been identified, but numbers alone told him nothing about their condition, or the lives tied to them. "I hate being a blue blood," Wyatt muttered, his voice heavy with frustration. Across from him, Clara looked up from her datapad, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Wyatt exhaled sharply, explaining the weight pressing down on him: thousands of buildings, unknown supplies, uncertain food sources, and people who had nothing left after the horrors they endured. He didn't know where to begin. Clara's response was calm, almost clinical. "Now imagine managing an entire principality," she said. "That is the burden of House Astor." The words hit him hard. Wyatt leaned forward, his voice quieter now, almost desperate. "How do you even manage something like that?" Clara answered simply, carefully. Generations of structured systems and trained administrators made it possible, but even then, it remained a monumental task. Seeing his frustration, she guided him back to basics. "Start simple. What do people need?" Wyatt paused, forcing himself to think clearly. "Shelter. Food. Clean water. Sanitation. The essentials of survival." Clara nodded approvingly and began outlining the realities. Food could be hunted, farmed, or traded, but clean water and sanitation required resources, planning, and infrastructure. Without those, everything else would fail. Wyatt sighed, realizing the truth. He would need tools, equipment, and above all, resources. That realization led him to the concept of business. If people could not produce everything themselves, they would need trade. But in a world recovering from invasion and decades of oppression, currency held little meaning. Bartering would dominate. Goods for goods. Skills for shelter. Survival through exchange. Wyatt quickly understood he would need negotiators, people who could secure deals and manage operations on his behalf. When he suggested simple industries like fishing and lumber, Clara pushed him further. Production alone wasn't enough. He needed a structure and economic system. Would he control everything? Share profits? Build something that benefited both himself and the people? Overwhelmed, Wyatt admitted he didn't understand half of it. Clara simplified it for him. "Do you want all the profit, or do you want your people to share in it?" The answer came quickly. He wanted to help them. Clara nodded and proposed a cooperative, a system where Wyatt, as the primary investor, would hold majority control, but the workers would share in the profits. It would give them not just wages, but ownership, purpose, hope. As she explained further, she revealed that among the rescued survivors were skilled individuals, workers, specialists, even exiled nobles. An accountant cast out by her own family. A highly educated bastard son seeking redemption. Both could prove invaluable. At the mention of children and the suffering inflicted by their captors, Wyatt fell silent. Pain flickered across his face, replaced by quiet determination. He didn't just want survival for these people, he wanted them to live. To laugh again. To feel safe. Profit no longer mattered to him. Soon after, preparations for deployment began. Inside the shuttle, Wyatt reviewed his selections carefully. Every role was chosen with purpose: fishermen to secure food, mechanics to repair aging systems, builders to restore shelter, and specialists to re-establish sanitation. A small but capable team of 14 formed the foundation. To ensure safety, a veteran sergeant major was assigned along with armed personnel. Additional experts followed: a veterinarian, a woodsman, a rail worker, and even a machinist, all chosen to evaluate the hidden potential of the land. Wyatt himself dressed simply, abandoning noble attire for common clothing. He wanted to blend in, to be seen not as a distant lord, but as one of them. Declan strongly objected, horrified at the idea of a noble appearing so ordinary. But Wyatt only smiled, revealing the concealed weapons beneath his coat. He wasn't defenseless, just practical. The shuttle finally descended near the outskirts of the southern town. As the group disembarked, tension filled the air. Armed escorts moved into formation, cautious but disciplined. Wyatt stepped forward with the others, walking toward the heart of the settlement. A clock tower rose in the distance, guiding their path. The houses they passed were simple, uniform, and eerily quiet. Wooden structures standing as silent witnesses to years of abandonment. And as Wyatt looked into the empty windows of those homes, one truth became clear. This wasn't just land. Wyatt's words lingered in the dusty air of the grand staircase, and his gaze shifting briefly toward Declan as they continued upward. "I told everyone to stop calling me that," he added, a faint edge of frustration beneath his calm tone. Declan gave a small, almost apologetic smile, his boots echoing softly against the stone steps. "Old habits, my Wyatt," he corrected himself awkwardly. "Titles are difficult to let go of. Especially when the man giving the orders acts exactly as one would expect a lord to act." Wyatt exhaled slowly, unsure whether to feel annoyed or amused. The truth was uncomfortable. He had never wanted authority like this, yet here he was, stepping into it naturally. Perhaps training had shaped him more than he realized. Or perhaps necessity had forced him to adapt. Either way, there was no time to dwell on it. They reached the uppermost floor, pushing open a stiff wooden door that groaned in protest. The room beyond was vast and clearly once important, a council chamber, perhaps. A long table dominated the center, its surface layered with years of dust. High-backed chairs surrounded it, some toppled, others still standing like silent sentinels of a forgotten era. Tall windows lined the far wall, their shutters half open, allowing thin beams of light to cut through the gloom. Wyatt stepped inside, his boots leaving clear tracks across the floor. He ran a hand across the table, revealing polished wood beneath the dust. "This could work," he murmured. "A central meeting place, coordination hub." Declan nodded, already scanning the room with a tactical eye. Defensible, too. Good visibility from the windows. If needed, this could serve more than one purpose. They didn't linger long. Moving methodically, they began descending floor by floor. Each level revealed more of the same: offices, storage rooms, records long since abandoned or decayed beyond recognition. Broken furniture, scattered papers, the quiet weight of time pressing down on everything. Yet beneath the decay, there was structure. Order. Potential. By the time they returned to the ground floor, the sound of movement greeted them. Ano had been busy. The young administrator had found cleaning supplies and cleared a section of the main hall. A table had been wiped down, chairs arranged, and a rough workspace established. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Wyatt gave an approving nod. "Good work." Ano straightened slightly, a hint of pride crossing his face. "Thank you, Wyatt." The hesitation was still there, but the effort was clear. Soon after, the others began to return. Small groups filtered back into the square and then into the town hall, each carrying observations, notes, and questions. The air slowly filled with voices: builders discussing structural weaknesses, mechanics listing damaged equipment, others reporting on supplies found or missing. It was chaotic, but it was progress. Wyatt stepped forward, raising his voice just enough to cut through the noise. "All right, everyone, reports, one at a time." What followed was the beginning of something far greater than any of them fully realized. Information was gathered, compared, and organized. Patterns began to emerge. Many of the buildings were structurally sound but needed repairs. Wells existed but required cleaning. Storage areas held remnants of old supplies, most unusable but some salvageable. It wasn't a dead town. It was a sleeping one. As the reports continued, Wyatt found himself writing constantly, organizing tasks, assigning priorities. Food production. Water purification. Shelter repairs. Each problem now had a path forward, even if the path was difficult. Time passed quickly. When Wyatt finally glanced at his datapad again, he noted the time with a small nod. Midday was approaching. The specialist on local flora and fauna would arrive soon, and with them, answers to one of their most pressing unknowns: what on this world could sustain life, and what could kill it? He looked around the room at the tired but focused faces, at the beginnings of structure forming out of chaos, and felt something shift within him. The weight was still there, heavy as ever. But now, it was accompanied by something else. Direction. "All right," Wyatt said, his voice steady, carrying a quiet authority that no longer felt forced. "We've made a good start. When our guide arrives, we expand operations. Until then, keep organizing what we have. This place," he paused, glancing toward the open doorway leading back to the square, where sunlight spilled across the worn stone. "This place is going to live again." And for the first time since setting foot on his barony, Wyatt believed it. The medic's words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, almost unreal against everything they had expected. Wyatt stared at the scanner, then at the gently flowing water in the fountain, as if confirming it with his own eyes. "You're certain?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with cautious hope. The medic nodded confidently. "As certain as this device allows, sir. It's not perfect, but it's reliable. The water's clean enough to drink with minimal treatment. Boiling it would be more than sufficient as a precaution." For a second, no one spoke. Then Wyatt let out a slow breath, something between relief and disbelief. "Clean water, and power," he murmured, glancing toward the now softly glowing windows of the inn and surrounding buildings. "That changes everything." Declan crossed his arms, looking toward the clock tower as its mechanism ticked faintly overhead. "It means this town isn't dead," he said quietly. "Just dormant." Wyatt gave a small nod. "Dormant. Waiting." He turned, raising his voice so those nearby could hear. "Everyone. We have running water and electricity." The reaction was immediate. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Then, slowly, the realization spread. Smiles appeared where exhaustion had been. Shoulders straightened. Hope, fragile but undeniable, began to take root. Ano nearly dropped his datapad in his rush to approach. "Sir Wyatt. This means we can prioritize restoration instead of survival planning," he said, excitement barely contained. "Lighting, heating, maybe even refrigeration if the systems are intact." Wyatt nodded, already thinking ahead. "One step at a time. But yes, this changes our priorities." He turned to Declan. "Find the electrician and the mechanic when they return. I want a full report on the generators and grid. If we've got power flowing, I want to know why and how long it'll last." Declan gave a sharp nod and moved off without hesitation. Wyatt remained by the fountain for a moment longer, watching the water ripple gently in the fading light of the afternoon. Less than a day ago, this place had been nothing more than a map and a problem. Now, it was becoming something else. A beginning. As the sun dipped lower, the town square came alive in a way it hadn't for decades. Windows stood open, letting fresh air push out the stale remnants of the past. Bedding aired in the breeze. Voices carried across the square as teams continued their work with renewed energy. Even the inn, once silent and empty, now glowed warmly from within, its lights cutting through the encroaching dusk. Wyatt eventually made his way back toward the inn, pausing briefly to watch Elizabeth in the distance. She stood surrounded by a small group, gesturing toward a cluster of plants near one of the houses, explaining something with animated confidence. The others listened closely, some taking notes, others simply absorbing every word. He allowed himself a faint smile. Maybe General Swallowtail had sent exactly the right person after all. Inside the inn, preparations for the evening were well underway. The cooks had managed to assemble a workable kitchen setup, combining salvaged tools with supplies from the shuttle. The smell of simple but warm food began to replace the lingering scent of dust and age. Ano approached again, more composed now but still energized. "Rooms have been allocated," he reported. "Everyone has a place for the night. I've kept a few spare in case we need them." "Good," Wyatt replied. "Make sure Elizabeth has one of the better rooms. She's earned it after that journey." Ano nodded and made a note immediately. Outside, the sky shifted into deep orange and purple hues as evening settled in. The first day, just the first day, was coming to an end. Wyatt stepped back out into the square, looking around at what they had accomplished in only a few hours. Buildings inspected. Shelters secured. Food sources identified. Water confirmed. Power restored. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close. But it was enough. As he stood there, the clock tower above them began to tick steadily, its mechanism fully awake once more. The sound echoed softly across the square. A quiet, rhythmic reminder that time, long frozen here, had started moving again. Wyatt folded his arms, his gaze steady as he looked out over the people now depending on him. "Day 1, he said under his breath. And somehow, against all odds, it had been a success. "Negative, General," Wyatt replied quickly, settling back into the pilot's seat as the shuttle climbed through the twilight sky. "Elizabeth arrived safely. In fact, she's already proven herself invaluable. This is about logistics." There was a brief pause on the line before General Swallowtail responded, his tone shifting from concern to attentive focus. "Go on." "We've secured a town," Wyatt continued, glancing down at the dimly lit streets below, now flickering with electric light for the first time in decades. "Water, power, barely, but it's running. Buildings are salvageable. Food sources exist, both preserved and potentially renewable. But the farms, they're spread out. On foot, it's inefficient. I need ground transport, something practical. Not armored, not military. Utility vehicles. Tractors, trucks, anything that can move people and supplies quickly." Another pause, longer this time. "You're building something faster than I expected," the general said slowly. "I don't have a choice," Wyatt replied. "I've got 6 days." A faint exhale came over the comms. "You always did have a habit of forcing the impossible into a timetable." Wyatt allowed himself a small smile. "I learned from the best." That earned a quiet chuckle. Then the general's voice sharpened again. "Very well. I can authorize a transport shuttle with civilian-grade vehicles. Light trucks, a couple of tractors, maybe even a small all-terrain carrier. But fuel will be limited. You'll need to establish your own supply soon." "We found a partially functioning harbor," Wyatt said. "Fishing vessels, fuel reserves, not much, but it's a start. There may be more inland." "Then I'll send what I can spare," the general replied. "ETA. Tomorrow morning, if weather holds." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet, Baron," the general added. "You're about to find out that building is harder than fighting." The line went quiet. Wyatt leaned back for a moment, staring out at the horizon where the last light of day faded into deep blue. Then he exhaled and switched channels. "Nav control, prepare cargo manifests for civilian deployment," he said. "We're scaling up operations at first light." The next morning, 06:10. The roar of shuttle engines echoed across the town square as Wyatt's craft descended once more. Below, the settlement was already awake. Smoke curled from the inn's chimney. People moved with purpose. What had been a dead town yesterday now breathed. As the ramp lowered, Wyatt stepped out and was immediately met by Declan. "My lord," Declan said, giving a short bow, though notably less exaggerated than before. You will be pleased to know preparations are underway. Maps have been copied. Teams are assembled. Wyatt nodded. Good. And Elizabeth? Already at work, Declan replied, gesturing toward a group near the edge of the square. She began cataloging plant life at dawn. She appears enthusiastic. Wyatt glanced over to see Elizabeth kneeling beside a patch of greenery, animatedly explaining something to a small group. One of them was hurriedly taking notes while another looked slightly alarmed at whatever she was holding. He smirked. That's one way to put it. As he turned back, Ano approached, tablet in hand. Ano spoke without preamble. All teams are ready. If your additional personnel arrive on schedule, we can begin full survey operations within the hour. They're on their way, Wyatt confirmed. Along with vehicles. That should solve our farm problem. Ano's eyes lit up slightly. That will increase efficiency by approximately 300%. Declan blinked. You calculated that already? I estimated, Ano replied calmly. Wyatt clapped his hands once. All right. Let's move. 6:45 Operation Expansion begins. The town square became a controlled storm of activity. Handymen dispersed in all directions, each carrying maps and marking tools. Builders and carpenters organized into larger teams, preparing to follow up on priority structures. Soldiers moved among them, maintaining order and ensuring no one worked alone. At the center of it all, Wyatt stood watching for a moment. This wasn't survival anymore. This was the beginning of something larger. A settlement. A foothold. Maybe even a future. Declan stepped beside him. You're thinking again, my lord. Wyatt didn't look at him. I'm thinking this might actually work. Declan allowed himself a small smile. Of course it will. Wyatt glanced sideways. You sound very confident. I am, Declan replied. Because you are. Wyatt snorted lightly. That might be the most dangerous reason I've ever heard. 7:10 incoming. A distant rumble rolled across the sky. All heads turned upward as a second shuttle broke through the clouds, larger than Wyatt's, its engines thundering as it descended toward the outskirts of town. Wyatt exhaled slowly. Right on time. As the transport settled and its ramp began to lower, silhouettes of vehicles became visible inside trucks, machinery, the promise of mobility. The next phase had begun. Wyatt turned to the others, letting his words hang in the air for a moment. Clara studied him carefully, a thoughtful expression crossing her face as she considered the logistics and the potential implications of his plan. Peacekeepers, you say? She finally asked, leaning forward. Training the local militia to the Auxilla standard, that could work, but you'd have to ensure discipline, chain of command, and that they remain loyal to HGO rather than outside influences. It's ambitious, Wyatt, but not impossible. Wyatt nodded, running a hand through his hair as he thought aloud. I know it's ambitious, but with the sergeant major and the experienced officers we've already brought along, I think it can be done. They need structure, clear instructions, and an understanding of the responsibilities they'll carry. Cynthia, who had been quietly listening while sipping her grape juice, added, and what about equipment? Weapons, uniforms, communication devices. You'll need all that if you want them to function like real Auxilla. Wyatt flicked through his datapad and nodded, already making mental notes. Yes, that's part of what I'll handle. I'll coordinate with House Ferrantes for any supplies we can't source locally. With the tax exemptions and the freighters they're sending, we should be able to equip them quickly enough. Clara raised an eyebrow. Wyatt, you're thinking about this as if it's a military campaign, not a rebuilding effort. But perhaps that's exactly what's needed. He grinned sheepishly. I suppose it is. HGO isn't just a town, it's a system that's been neglected for decades. If we don't start thinking strategically, we'll just be patching holes forever. Clara nodded, and then, with a small smile, said, Very well, Baron. Let's assume you get your militia trained and your guides published, your supplies delivered, and your vehicles running. What next? Wyatt leaned back, tapping the pad with his finger. Next, we make HGO self-sufficient. Agriculture, fisheries, industry, trade routes, and we ensure the people know how to maintain it all. Elizabeth's guide will help them understand the local environment, the militiamen will provide security, and with the right equipment and training, I think we can turn this place into a functioning hub. Cynthia laughed softly. You make it sound so simple. But I have to admit, with your energy, Wyatt, it might actually happen. Clara's expression softened. Just remember, Wyatt, you can't do it all yourself. You need people you trust to manage parts of this while you handle the bigger picture. Wyatt's grin widened. That's the plan, Clara. Delegation, supervision, and a lot of running around. Clara shook her head, smiling fondly. Well, then, you've got my blessing. And I suggest you start by visiting General Swallowtail and arranging that locksmith and the vehicle. Every plan begins with action. Wyatt nodded, rising from his chair with renewed purpose. Agreed. I'll get started immediately. Thank you both. Really. I don't know what I'd do without your guidance. With that, Wyatt left Clara's quarters, the grape juice left untouched on the table. As he walked down the corridor toward the shuttle bay, he felt the weight of responsibility settle comfortably on his shoulders. The town, the militia, the guides, the supplies, it all felt like pieces of a giant puzzle. And for the first time in days, he felt like he actually knew where the edges were. The shuttle awaited him, and with it, the first steps toward transforming HGO from a neglected outpost into a thriving, self-sufficient hub. Wyatt climbed aboard, checked the systems, and as the engines hummed to life, he plotted his course back to the town and the tasks that would finally put his plans into motion. Would you like me to continue with Wyatt's first day implementing these plans on HGO, including meeting the locksmiths, gathering the carpenters, and coordinating the militia training? Shop Elizabeth had just disappeared into. Wyatt paused mid-step, looking up at the staircase, a grin tugging at his lips. Knew what, he called, though he already had a pretty good idea. Elizabeth's voice came again, louder this time, carrying the unmistakable mix of exasperation and amusement. You knew I'd find out about the hidden storage in the barracks. You sneak. Wyatt laughed openly, shaking his head as he continued walking. Well, someone has to keep you on your toes, he replied, his tone playful but sincere. By the time he reached the door, the crowd around the square had grown restless with curiosity. Children peeked around corners, elders whispered speculations, and the handful of people Wyatt had brought with him earlier now hovered near the crates he'd ordered delivered. All right, everyone, he called, raising both hands to quiet the murmurs, let's get to work. The crates contain supplies that will be crucial for our first weeks in New Town. I want them opened carefully, sorted, and allocated where needed. Declan and his men stepped forward immediately, expertly hoisting the crates and beginning to unpack their contents. Wyatt watched, noting the precision and teamwork, and allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. See that, he muttered to no one in particular. This is what happens when people are given a purpose in some respect. Not just orders, respect. He moved to inspect the unpacked items, tools, small machinery parts, food rations, and various essential supplies carefully packed and labeled. Everything accounted for, he whispered, feeling a rare sense of calm amid the usual chaos of establishing New Town. Elizabeth finally descended the staircase, a mix of amusement and mock outrage on her face. You knew, didn't you, she demanded, pointing at Wyatt. About the storage, the extra supplies, the fact that you've already mapped everything out? Wyatt gave her a cheeky shrug. Maybe, he admitted. Or maybe I just learned a thing or two about preparing for the unexpected. Her eyes softened, though she still looked like she wanted to protest. You do realize this means more work for me, she said. Wyatt's grin widened. Exactly. Welcome to New Town, Elizabeth. We've got a lot to do, and I need the best help I can get. The sun was beginning to dip behind the buildings of the square, casting long shadows and bathing the scene in a golden glow. Wyatt took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, but also the exhilaration of progress. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to imagine a thriving new town, where families would be safe, where children could play without fear, and where the people would have a chance to rebuild their lives. With a final glance at the unloading crates, he turned toward the assembled residents. "All right, let's set up the shops, the living quarters, and the training areas," he announced. "We have a long road ahead, but together, we can make this place more than just a settlement. We can make it a home." Murmurs of approval and renewed energy rippled through the crowd. Wyatt felt a rare flicker of hope. This was just the beginning, but for the first time, he believed in what they could accomplish. He glanced at Elizabeth and Doc Smith, who were already organizing groups of volunteers, assigning tasks, and checking the unpacked supplies. Wyatt smiled to himself. Newtown was alive now, not just a vision, but a community in motion. And as the people moved purposefully around the square, he allowed himself a small, private vow: he would do everything in his power to ensure no one, especially the children, would ever have to endure the hardships of the eternal garden again. The evening descended, soft and calm, and Wyatt stood in the center of the square, watching, listening, and planning the next steps. There would be countless challenges ahead, but he felt a quiet certainty. With capable people, careful planning, and a shared determination, they could transform Newtown into a sanctuary and perhaps, in time, a symbol of hope for all who had suffered too long. Would you like me to continue the next part where Wyatt starts organizing the children's education and the first cooperative tasks in Newtown? Expected, yes, Jurgen said, glancing down at the piles of notes. These records are based on what was planted, the expected growth rate, average rainfall, and pest control measures. It isn't a guarantee, but it gives a reliable estimate. If you wish, I can run through each field and give you a projection for everything from porcupines to grains, orchards, and vegetables. Wyatt's eyes lit up at the prospect. This was exactly what he needed to start planning supplies, rationing, and distribution. "Please do," he replied, settling onto the edge of the large stone desk, his data pad ready to record every detail. Jurgen began systematically, starting from the northernmost fields and moving south. Wyatt watched with fascination as he read numbers, scribbled calculations, and occasionally muttered to himself about yields and planting rotations. He realized that the intricacy of the farm's organization rivaled that of a small principality. Every field, animal enclosure, and orchard was logged, rotated, and accounted for. Wyatt leaned closer, asking questions at every turn. "And if the porcupines get sick or a predator enters the field?" he inquired. Jurgen shrugged slightly, a practiced expression on his face. "Then you adapt, sir. Nothing in farming is ever certain. Rainfall may be heavy, pests may increase, and disease is always a threat. That's why careful monitoring is essential. Even with the best projections, you must always leave room for error." Wyatt nodded thoughtfully, imagining how he could integrate this into his broader plan for Newtown. There was food security here, yes, but also risks, and he needed to account for both. Elizabeth, who had been quietly observing, chimed in: "The key is prevention. Secure enclosures, regular inspections, and careful breeding. The porcupines are hardy, but they need attention. You can't just leave them and hope for the best." Wyatt noted this, impressed by her knowledge and how much she had retained from her father's teachings. Jurgen continued for nearly an hour, detailing each crop, livestock count, and expected harvest. Wyatt was amazed at the depth of records and the foresight shown by the previous farm managers. Every crop rotation, fertilization schedule, and seed batch was noted. They paused briefly as Elizabeth pointed out a section of land that had been left fallow last year. "This is important," she explained. "Rotating crops prevents disease and restores nutrients to the soil. Without it, your yields will diminish over time." Wyatt scribbled furiously in his data pad, imagining how this principle could be applied to every farm in the district, eventually creating a self-sustaining system. Declan, who had been quietly observing while ensuring everyone remained safe around the porcupines, commented quietly, "This is more than farming, it's logistics, engineering, and biology all rolled into one." Wyatt smiled at him, silently agreeing. The task ahead was massive, but today he had taken the first concrete steps to understanding the resources at his disposal. By mid-morning, they had finished surveying the fields and livestock. Wyatt stood atop a low hill near the center of the farm, surveying the expanse before him. Rolling fields stretched to the horizon, dotted with small porcupine shelters, silos, and orchards, each meticulously arranged. He felt the weight of responsibility, knowing that every number he had just absorbed represented meals, survival, and the potential stability of the growing settlement. Turning to Jurgen, he asked, if we had twice the manpower, could this farm double its output without risking the animals or soil? Jurgen's expression was thoughtful. In theory, yes. But only if careful management is maintained. Too many hands without coordination, and mistakes happen: injured animals, wasted crops, missed rotations. It's not just about work, it's about planning and oversight. Wyatt nodded, understanding that leadership would be as important as physical effort. They moved on to inspect the processing buildings, the barns, workshops, and storage facilities. Wyatt examined the grain silos, noting their capacity and condition, then moved on to the meat processing area for the porcupigs. Elizabeth gave him a detailed explanation of how the quills were removed safely and how the carcasses were divided for different purposes: meat, hides, and breeding stock. Wyatt realized that this level of organization was rare, even in established settlements. He made detailed notes, not just for resource planning, but also to train his own militia and auxiliary in basic agricultural management. Jurgen smiled at Wyatt's enthusiasm, clearly impressed by his ability to absorb complex information quickly. As the sun began its slow climb toward noon, Wyatt gathered his small group for a final walk around the property. They checked the water supply, ensuring wells and irrigation systems were functioning correctly, and observed the workers in the fields. Wyatt made careful notes about areas needing repair, additional labor, or better equipment. By the time they returned to the APC, everyone was sweating, tired, but invigorated. Wyatt felt a sense of accomplishment. This visit had been more than a survey, it had been a full immersion into the lifeblood of Newtown. He realized that understanding the farms and their output was not just about sustenance, but about building a foundation for a future society, resilient and well-prepared. Before they departed, Wyatt spoke to Jurgen and Elizabeth. I need you both to prepare detailed instructions for anyone who might manage this farm while we expand. Everything from sowing schedules to animal care and rotation principles. I want a system that can survive without me present. Jurgen nodded, impressed by Wyatt's foresight, while Elizabeth smiled knowingly, pleased that her knowledge was valued. With that, they climbed back into the APC. Wyatt took one last look at the farm, the fields, and the porcupigs grazing peacefully. He knew that the data he had gathered today would inform the decisions that shaped Newtown for years to come. As the vehicle rumbled away, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction, a small victory, yet crucial in the long road ahead. As they followed the driveway, the third farm began to reveal itself in more detail. To the left, there were large, well-kept fields of wheat, barley, and rye, each section separated by neat hedgerows and irrigation channels. On the right, a cluster of orchards stretched towards a small wooded area, the trees heavy with fruit that glinted in the late afternoon sun. Wyatt noted the efficiency of it all. Rows perfectly aligned, paths swept clean, and no sign of neglect despite the earlier chaos from the Drazen raids. Elizabeth walked slightly ahead, examining the various crops with a practiced eye. These fields are impressive, she said. If the labor and irrigation are maintained properly, this farm alone could feed Newtown for months. Wyatt nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, already calculating the manpower, supplies, and tools needed to bring everything fully online. He could see where the previous farmers had been clever, leaving gates open for animal movement and using automation where possible, but it was clear that without intervention, a lot of potential food was going to waste. The farmhouse came into view, larger than Wyatt expected, with a central stone building flanked by two wings. Smoke curled from a chimney, suggesting that someone or something was still using the place, though no people were visible. Wyatt gestured to Elizabeth. Stay close. We don't know if anyone's here, or what their response will be. They moved quietly across the yard, noting the presence of stacked hay bales, a few tractors parked haphazardly, and several barns that looked to be in decent repair. As they approached one of the barns, a low sound reached Wyatt's ears, a soft clucking that intensified as they drew nearer. Pushing open the barn door, he was greeted by a rush of activity. Hundreds of chickens, some feeding, some pecking at the straw, others perched on beams overhead. Elizabeth crouched down, pointing to a set of larger birds with striking plumage. "Those are young hens," she whispered. "If we can get them laying consistently, this place could produce thousands of eggs per month." Wyatt made a mental note, already imagining crates stacked and transported back to Newtown. From the far side of the barn, Wyatt spotted a small, enclosed pen where a few deer wandered, their udders clearly full. He motioned for Elizabeth to follow him quietly. "If the milking system here works like the last farm," he murmured, "we could have a self-sustaining dairy system without much effort." Elizabeth nodded, scanning the mechanical setup and the nearby wind turbine. "Everything seems operational," she said. "At least, from what I can see. Someone's been keeping this place in order, at least partially." Wyatt scribbled notes, already plotting logistics in his head. The farm had potential, but harnessing it would require careful planning and perhaps a few stern conversations with the locals if they wanted to keep this system running. They spent the next hour cataloging every field, animal pen, and building, noting which machines needed repairs and which were ready to go. By the time the sun began its descent, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet, Wyatt climbed back to the turret of the APC with Elizabeth beside him. Below them, the farm stretched out like a patchwork quilt of opportunity, each section telling a story of careful planning, neglect, and resilience. "We've got work to do," Wyatt said quietly, mostly to himself. Elizabeth placed a hand on his arm. "And a lot of food to save," she added, her tone hopeful. Wyatt allowed himself a small smile, knowing that, for once, the odds were finally leaning in their favor. The APC rumbled to life, and they began the drive back, plotting routes in his mind, already planning which fields and barns would be tackled first. This farm, like the others, was more than just a collection of buildings and crops, it was a lifeline for Newtown. And Wyatt intended to make sure every last bit of it counted. Wyatt led Declan along the overgrown path, keeping his eyes alert for any sign of danger, though the immediate threat of the Drazen had passed. The ruins of the estate spread around them like the bones of some long-forgotten leviathan, moss and vines claiming walls and terraces once polished and cared for. As they walked, Wyatt couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection to this place. There was chaos here, yes, but also the faint whispers of what it had once been. A home, a garden, a statement of pride and ambition. "This place has potential," he said quietly to Declan, who kept a careful pace beside him. "All it needs is attention, care, and someone who isn't afraid to make the hard choices." Declan nodded, recognizing in Wyatt's tone a rare mixture of pragmatism and hope. "I understand, my lord. And we'll be ready for whatever comes." When they reached the main courtyard beyond the second set of walls, the ornate fish pond glimmered under the sunlight, still filled with water and swimming fish, though leaves and debris had collected around the edges. Wyatt paused and ran his fingers along the rim of the pond, imagining the scene when the estate had been alive with activity, noble guests strolling among the orange trees, laughter drifting from the glasshouses, and the hum of life filling every corner. He turned to Declan and smiled faintly. "It's hard to see it now, but we could bring this back. Not as it was, but perhaps better, safer, more functional, and still beautiful." Declan studied the pond and the surrounding terraces, his mind picturing workmen clearing debris, gardeners tending rows of vegetables and fruit trees, and children laughing as they explored the ruins safely. "Then let's make it happen," he said simply. They moved onward, navigating a series of terraces cut into the hillside. Grass and shrubs hid shallow slopes, but Wyatt carefully stepped between patches, mindful of his footing. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the distant coastline barely visible through the trees. "From here, the view is spectacular. The sea, the town, all of it. If we restore the gardens and trim back the overgrowth, it will be breathtaking." Declan glanced in the direction Wyatt indicated, imagining wide lawns and paths winding through manicured flower beds, the sun glinting off fountains and polished stonework. Wyatt's enthusiasm was infectious, and even Declan, who rarely indulged in fantasies, allowed himself to imagine the estate as a living monument, a place of beauty and calm rather than ruin and danger. They reached a cluster of northern buildings, stone barns with sagging roofs and broken carts leaning at odd angles. The walls were crumbling in places, But there was enough intact to suggest that with careful work, these structures could be repaired and repurposed. Wyatt ran a hand along the rough stone, noting spots where the masonry could be reinforced. This could be storage for tools, or even greenhouses, he said. If we're going to turn these gardens into a proper park, we'll need supplies and space to work. These barns are the perfect start. Declan nodded silently, scanning the surrounding area for any threats, as he always did. Wyatt noticed him and smiled. "Don't worry, Declan. No Drazen here today. Just us and the work ahead." Elizabeth, waiting in the APC, climbed out when Wyatt and Declan returned. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity as she looked at the northern structures. "These barns could be incredible if they're restored," she said. "And the surrounding gardens. They could produce enough to sustain a whole village if managed correctly." Wyatt chuckled. "You think too small, Elizabeth. I want this to be more than a sustainable farm. I want it to be a place of beauty, a park where people come to relax, learn, and remember. The ruins, the orchards, the terraces, it can all coexist. But it will take time, patience, and care." The three of them walked together along the driveway, imagining the estate as it could be. Wyatt's mind was already racing with plans, not just for the buildings and gardens, but for how to use the natural contours of the land, the terraces, the hidden paths, and the streams. Elizabeth made careful notes in her book, sketching ideas for planting schemes, irrigation, and the care of exotic fruits in the orrery. Declan, ever watchful, walked beside Wyatt silently, absorbing both the practical challenges and the excitement in Wyatt's voice. The Barony of the Screaming Forests was wild, untamed, and dangerous, but it was also full of possibility. Wyatt felt a surge of determination. This land would be more than a memorial for past mistakes, it would be proof that even chaos could be shaped into something magnificent. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the estate, Wyatt paused and looked out toward the distant horizon where the sea glimmered faintly. "It won't be easy," he said softly, almost to himself, "but nothing worthwhile ever is." Elizabeth stopped beside him, her eyes reflecting the last of the sunlight. "Then let's make it happen," she said, her voice firm but filled with excitement. Declan's silent presence, steady and unwavering, felt like the final piece of their fragile but determined team. Wyatt smiled, the weight of his title and responsibilities momentarily easing in the shared resolve of the people around him. Together, they would breathe life back into this ruined estate, transforming it into a legacy of hope, beauty, and remembrance. Wyatt sat back in the corner of the inn, the last remnants of bread pudding on his plate and a glass of cold apple cordial in hand. The quiet hum of the restaurant surrounded him, though his mind was far from at ease. Anno shuffled through a stack of papers, each one detailing discoveries and assessments made earlier in Newtown, and began summarizing the day's findings. Wyatt listened intently, occasionally pausing to make notes or ask for clarification. "They were trying to save you," he said quietly to Declan earlier, thinking back to the loyalty and courage shown by those who had risked their lives for a noble they barely knew. Very few commoners would do that. "It speaks volumes about both your character and theirs." Declan had looked at him with a mix of humility and pride, and Wyatt felt a quiet warmth at that acknowledgement. As Anno laid out the reports, Wyatt traced the growth and status of the three farms. The first farm, solid and manageable, seemed primed for development. Its buildings required minor cosmetic repairs, the porcupines and deer were healthy, and though their numbers were slightly diminished, Wyatt understood that patience and careful management could restore balance. The second farm was larger, the fields sprawling, and though it required more attention in terms of machinery, its potential was undeniable. The third farm, while smaller, offered a bounty of fruits and vegetables and was bustling with young chicks and the occasional goat, though its dairy operations had ceased. Wyatt absorbed the details, nodding thoughtfully as Anno explained that much of the machinery would need replacement, but that accessories and solid metal equipment were largely intact. A full restoration was feasible, though expensive. Jurgen's input was invaluable. He outlined the precise needs for each farm. A versatile combine harvester capable of handling multiple crops, a large tractor for each primary farm, a smaller one for the third, and various root harvesters and seed drills. Wyatt winced at the costs, 500,000 credits for the harvester alone, but accepted it as part of his growing responsibility to the people under his care. Jurgen then shared his personal preference for managing the first farm, citing its balance of size, accessibility, and untapped potential. Wyatt smiled and granted him the farm immediately, promising assistance in finding capable hands to support the effort. Once the farms were accounted for, Wyatt focused on the discoveries throughout Newtown itself. Anno described the locksmith's work, revealing that they had managed to unlock over 1,000 homes and businesses, giving the town a solid foundation for occupation and security. The uniform locks and the hand-operated key-cutting machines meant that creating new keys was fast and inexpensive, an efficiency Wyatt welcomed. From there, the conversation moved to the industrial and commercial buildings, the brewery, chemical processing plants, and a small electric vehicle factory. Wyatt was impressed by the meticulous state of these facilities, noting that many appeared recently operational, clean, and ready for use. He absorbed every detail, from the milk tanker in perfect condition to the small trucks and machinery scattered across the yards, recognizing the immense potential for both industry and defense. Other facilities included a restaurant by the harbor, basic but functional, a small warehouse brimming with crates of apples, workshops for repairing agricultural machinery, a tannery with leather processing pits, a cannery for preserved goods, a refrigeration facility for ice making, and a sawdust-to-egg box production line. Wyatt even smiled at the discovery of woodworking centers with massive computer-controlled machining equipment, ready to transform timber into beams and furniture components. Each discovery layered new possibilities in his mind. The potential for sustenance, trade, defense, and industrial output was immense, but it also meant careful planning, delegation, and patience. By the time Anno finished recounting the day's findings, Wyatt set down his glass and plate, feeling a deep mixture of fatigue and cautious optimism. The breadth of responsibility now resting on him was staggering: over 1,500 people depending on his decisions, farms to manage, machinery to restore, and industrial infrastructure to utilize. Yet beneath the exhaustion, a spark of clarity had formed. He was beginning to see the outlines of strategy, the path from chaos toward order, and the way he could shape the future of Newtown. Setting aside the last crumbs and taking a final sip of cordial, Wyatt carried his dishes to the kitchen, thanked the staff, and climbed the stairs to his room. As he collapsed onto the bed, sleep claimed him quickly, the hum of the inn fading into the background. Even as he drifted off, his mind traced the threads of plans, people, and possibilities, aware that tomorrow would demand more of him, but also certain that he had already taken the first steps toward mastery of it all.